The late 70s were a great time for blue-collar movies. Stories about working-class heroes struggling against the unfeeling power structures that show little to no concern for the well-being of those toiling on the ground in service of the company's profits. A rich vein of such stories clearly tapped into something in the zeitgeist during the back half of that decade. Factory workers, office drones, even petty thieves found themselves under the filmmaker's gaze, but there's one of working-class cinema's entries from that era that proves more lasting, more bankable than the rest. Of course, I'm talking about Alien. Ridley Scott's tale of a team of long-haul truckers rerouted on a company errand and sabotaged by a union-busting company stooge who refuses to follow quarantine protocols has spawned 6 sequels across 6 decades thanks to the iconic creature design of the titular alien.
It's a damn company. What about our lives, you son of a bitch?
You don't trust me for the same reason the company didn't trust me to lead this mission.
Is there an agenda that you're not telling us about?
But something happened somewhere over the centuries in which the franchise is set. The movies became about something else.
I am your father.
So, when exactly did Aliens stop being about space truckers? There are a few more iconic science fiction beasties than the Xenomorph, the Predator, the Terminator, and that's about it. It's easy now to credit H.R. Giger's design alone with the series' longevity, and that might be fair. Both of the other franchises have had similar runs for no real narrative reason to continue after the first or second entries. With the Alien franchise, though, there's been a slow shift in the focus of the storytelling, a change in who the filmmakers choose to care most about on screen. It's a long walk, thematically speaking, to get from the crew of the Nostromo hauling mineral to Peter Weyland wanting to meet his creator before he dies. And with a chunk of the marketing push around Romulus touting a return to the franchise's roots, just what exactly does that mean? Ridley Scott's masterpiece that launched the whole Alien franchise actually has a very small amount of Alien in it. The front half of the film is loaded with atmospheric shots of the Nostromo, more concerned with the technology on which the crew's lives depend than with any alien threat. It's all discussions of hazard pay and getting a bump to full shares and fixing a dodgy ship. The efforts to establish that the characters are surviving at the whims of Weyland Yutani range from explicitly narrative, like waking up to find you've been diverted by a subroutine in the ship's computer, to metaphorical, like naming the ship's computer Mother.
Morning, Mother.
Either way, Parker and Brett aren't working anymore until their pay situation gets ironed out.
What's the matter?
The long and lingering shots that open the film are eerie, famously so. But it's important to remember, we haven't even met the alien yet. All these decades later, with the Xenomorph so familiar a figure, it's easy to forget that at this stage of the movie, it hasn't technically appeared on screen. These opening shots are not tied to a threat from a monster. They're a cold reminder of how inhuman it is to exist in a long-haul spacecraft. Even after John Hurt's Kane is attacked by the facehugger, the friction in the story is not about survival. It's about protocol. The alien is incidental to the situation that the crew finds themselves in, at odds with the wants of the company.
You know the quarantine procedure.
24 hours for decontamination.
You could die in 24 hours, open ahead.
It's a full half an hour, a quarter of the runtime, before anything alien even shows up on screen, and more than halfway through the film before we finally see the title character. From that point on, the crew scrambles to rig what they can to defend themselves against the alien and the company agent they didn't know they had to worry about. Death by magazine is not a thing you ever see coming, even when I rewatch the movie. Super weird. But, out of context of the entire franchise that came later, there's as big a scare in realizing Ash is a robot as there is in anything with the Xenomorph, body horror included. His monsterdom, as a representative of the company, is treated with the same kind of on-screen terror. Prior to this reveal, there's a facelessness to the company, an ominous presence controlling their fates. To suddenly find out that an agent of that control has been present this whole time is potentially a terrifying religious experience, particularly when that agent tells you that you don't matter in the grand scheme.
Bring back life form. Priority 1. All other priorities rescinded.
Once there are only 3 votes left, and they decide to blow up the ship, the movie shifts into its thrilling haunted house gear and gives way to the movie monster that launched decades worth of sequels. But the reason we care about whether or not Ripley survives, just who is responsible for the unjust situation that killed her whole crew, has been firmly established.
I admire its purity. A survivor,
I'm Burke. Carter Burke. I work for the company.
unclouded by conscience
Don't let that fool you. I'm really an okay guy.
or delusions of morality. I can't lie to you about your chances.
Blind luck. It's 1 in 1,000, really.
You have my sympathies.
With Aliens, James Cameron picks up right where the original film left off, both with Ripley cryo-sleeping in a lifeboat and with Weyland Yutani execs being the real monsters. But also, one of the first spoken lines in the entire film is,
Ah, there goes our salvage, guys.
the blue-collar company owns you theme hits even harder in the director's cut, which includes Ripley outliving her daughter in the 56 years she was adrift and a look at the families on Hadley's Hope before the Xenomorphs took them out. But none of that is what Aliens is remembered for. That is, of course, the Marines.
Have a glorious day in the Corps.
These are the men and women James Cameron is asking us to empathize with. It's their stories front and center, led by an inept newbie, marched into doom by a company stooge. While they're not technically space truckers, they are still expendable cogs in the gears of Weyland Yutani's bottom line.
No offense. None taken.
In fact, one of the biggest similarities between the first two films, aside from Acid Blood, is the moment where the characters spend actual time considering whether or not they should screw over the company for their own survival.
It's the only way to be sure.
It should also be mentioned, in contrast to the surprise heel turn from Ash, this film's synthetic Bishop is not programmed to bring an alien specimen back at all costs. Meanwhile, thanks to an incredibly wormy performance by Paul Reiser, Burke puts an even more human face to corporate greed than the first film's robotic science officer.
Mr. Burke gave instructions that they were to be kept alive in stasis for return to the company labs. He was very specific about it.
It's a change that works as a sort of paper trail that answers the question of why am I here and why is this happening to me before the franchise begins to ask that question more explicitly. As opposed to the original 1979 film where the company was only represented by the technology surrounding the characters, a kind of absentee parent to the crew, Aliens is able to spend time with the company men and women responsible for deeming Ripley and the Marines expendable. It's world building for us in the audience, but for the characters on screen, it's a chance to see firsthand their place in the greater order of the company, to meet their maker before they die, so to speak. A motive that will sound familiar just a few sequels from now.
Ripley, you know, I expected more from you. I thought you'd be smarter than this.
Why do we have to kill it? You just said the company's coming for it.
Those 2 specimens are worth millions to the bioweapons division.
They can't control it. They don't understand. It'll kill them all.
What's wrong with that?
A lot of innocent people will die.
You were responsible for the deaths of 157 colonists. I don't know which species is worse. You don't see them f***ing each other over for a goddamn percentage.
Them.
With Alien 3, or Alien Cubed, depending on how you want to read that title, and I don't know how into math you are, we can safely say we're into the less heralded portion of the franchise. A quick aside in defense of the director's cut, though, the film does include ideas that are dealt with throughout like a proper movie should, but looking at it in context of a studio expecting a follow-up to James Cameron's film, you can see why it wound up being something else entirely, but you never really know with these things.
This is rumor control, here are the facts.
Right. So, after Ripley crash lands on an all-male penal colony, the franchise gets its first taste of religious fervor. Top to bottom, this is a movie about faith. The inmates enjoy a sort of cult-like existence in their isolation. They've found their place, taken their vows, and don't want any intrusion. And Ripley is faced with the tragedy of loss in a way she hadn't before, outside of Cameron's director's cut of Aliens. But one character in particular, Assistant Warden Aaron, might actually be hinting at the bigger shift in the franchise to come. He's got an unfounded faith in Weyland Yutani, that he matters to them. It's a characteristic the inmates all make fun of, and one that ultimately kills him. David Fincher's Alien 3 is getting a little better with age, but one thing that it did for the franchise in retrospect was take the metaphor of the corporate deity pulling the strings of Ripley's fate to a more spiritual place. It shows the consequences of meeting somebody you've had faith in and expecting them to care about you. The Jesus pose at the end doesn't hurt either. Speaking of Jesus poses, resurrection is right there in the title of the fourth Alien film. Set a solid 200 years after Ripley tossed herself into a furnace, the franchise moves into literally creating life from scratch by cloning Ripley into the perfect host for a new hybrid alien. Sure, there is the rough-and-tumble group of space pirates randomly stuck in the middle of Weyland Yutani's machinations. But where this movie moves the needle away from space truckers is by clearly opening the door to the dynamic between creators and their creations. It doesn't necessarily walk through that door, or even ponder anything interesting about the existence of the door in general. It does include Winona Ryder's synthetic character, Call, a second-generation robot made by other robots. It's at least an interesting addendum to the idea of creation, particularly when the movie ends with a cloned Ripley and her synthetic sidekick hanging out on a scorched earth, representing some kind of future for a new humanity, I guess. The movie, though, existing 200 years beyond the lived-in future of the first three films, feels even more distantly sci-fi than its predecessors somehow. The first three movies felt like a recognizable version of life, albeit with interstellar travel, and that's largely due to the fact that space truckers were the main characters. So, the idea of robots making robots, or enhanced clones that are good at basketball in Alien Resurrection, can be easily written off as basic science fiction tropes as opposed to legitimate thematic elements.
There's a monster in your chest.
My. You're pregnant.
And in a few hours, it's gonna burst its way through your rib cage. And you're gonna die.
Please, get it out of me. Get it out of me!
Who are you?
Ah!
I'm the monster's mother.
The longest gap between films in the franchise, Prometheus finds Ridley Scott returning to the franchise for the first time for a prequel. To find the exact moment the franchise stopped being about space truckers officially, one would most likely have to go back to Scott's development meetings, because this film is, all of a sudden, literally about the origins of mankind. It's strange to say it, but the movie is not really an Alien movie at all. It does something so thoroughly different that part of me thinks it was a different movie altogether that wasn't going to get made.
It's Christmas.
Until Ridley Scott said, okay, how about I make it a prequel to Alien?
This is rumor control. Here are the facts.
Right? Sorry. So, anyway, the main characters are scientists and a synthetic named David. Idris Elba and his flight crew add a little space trucker energy, but only on the fringes. We get a little bit to hang on in getting to know Elizabeth Shaw, but the key difference is that she's there by choice. It's not a company directive. It's her research leading the team to their fates.
So you're saying we're here because of a map?
An invitation.
From whom?
We call them engineers.
Further into the core of the film is Peter Weyland, of some relationship to Charles Bishop Weyland, we can suppose, and his selfishly wanting to meet his maker before he dies. He spends trillions, sacrifices lives, manipulates a crew and his own daughter to get there, but the only reason he has the opportunity to do all that is through Dr. Shaw's work.
As far as you're concerned, they're both in charge.
That's the most integral piece that makes this movie very much not about space truckers. Everybody can relate to getting ground down by their day job. It's much harder to relate to a scientist and a billionaire searching for the origin of mankind with a robotic stand-in for a son tagging along. Similar to some of the ideas acknowledged but not touched by Alien Resurrection, however, the idea of creation is the theme du jour here. Shaw can't have children of her own, but is later impregnated by way of the mysterious Black Death goo. Weyland claims David as a son, but ignores his actual daughter Meredith. Progeny, and who begat who, or who can begat at all, are chief concerns in Prometheus, which is ironic in a meta-sense, given that Ridley Scott, grandfather of the entire franchise, returned to the director's chair to explore those ideas.
Ask him where they're from.
What are you doing?
Ask him what's in his cargo.
I was not made to serve.
And it was meant for us.
Neither were you.
I need to know why. What did we do wrong? Why do you hate us?
They are a dying species, grasping for resurrection. They don't deserve to start again, and I'm not going to let them. What do you believe in, David?
Creation.
Ridley Scott's sequel to his prequel is perhaps the most accidental encounter with Xenomorph lore that a group of regular people could hope for. It's a solar flare, a cosmic fluke that damages a ship full of colonists, and the command crew that wakes to deal with it hears a distress signal from a nearby planet that happens to be both A, suitable for human habitation, and B, the very planet to which David brought the black goo of death to destroy the engineers after the events of Prometheus. But again, The movie doesn't belong to the colonists. It begins and ends with the creator and his creation, the relationship between Peter Weyland and his only son David. It's about David's desire to create and perfect, his rivalry with a would-be brother, and the insidious way he continues laying the groundwork for the original movie. The colonists, the crew of the Covenant, they're all just collateral damage. Incidental cannon fodder for the story of a robot with daddy issues. The proof of this is actually in Billy Crudup's character, the unexpected Captain Oram. His faith is presented as a kind of insecurity. There's a through line of faith in the franchise, be it devoted company men or inmates of a prison planet, yet Oram's beliefs are barely touched on. They're window dressing in an arc playing second fiddle to David's machinations. As the franchise moves back to its roots, it's not to do with practical effects or spooky corridors on derelict space stations. If the roots of the franchise are at all worth going back to, it's thanks to a refocus on, in Romulus's case, a ragtag group of Weyland Yutani's indentured class, and the film is better for it. Turns out, it was time to get back to space truckers.
It's the only thing good on the ship.